Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. Now, before we begin, let's address the elephant on screen. If you may recall, I'm someone that suffers from allergies, and unfortunately one of the side effects of my allergies is I get breakouts from time to time. So if you can ignore what's going on my face, let's get into it. Well, with a new year comes a new topic. So let's step away from prose and fiction and discuss another form, perhaps the earliest form of expression, poetry. The term itself is derived from the ancient Greek word poiesis, which means to make or create, though the form of poetry is at least 1,000 years older than the Mycenaean period in ancient Greece. The two oldest poems are the Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor and the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you want to take up the style, those might be a good place to start, at the roots. But beyond the history, what is poetry? Well, that's where things get a little interesting. The Britannica Encyclopedia Online has a section, Attempts to Define Poetry. Not exactly off to a good start there. Of course, most of us know poetry when we see it or hear it. Unlike prose, poetry focuses on beats and verse. It is an expression that generates more emotional connection. Some famous poets define it as something that we already know, but done so in a finer or fancier expression. Others say that poetry expresses something that we would not know or feel without first doing so. As you can see, what poetry is likely something philosophers will have to answer. As for a more generalized definition, a poem uses the rhythmic or lyrical qualities of language to evoke meaning and create a composition. As I said, people usually know it when they see it, and more often than not, when they feel it. Of course, a lot of this definition is what poetry does. If you look at poetry or a poem itself, the how of it gets a little more simple. And for that, I think poetry expert Annie Finch gives the best look, and that is language or a tale, structured using the repetition of a language element. A little more paraphrased than hers, but essentially the same. But what does that mean? Well, the key there is repetition. This is what gives poetry form. Now, as Annie points out, the repeated element can be anything, so long as it remains the same. This element is also what allows poetry to be so wide-ranging, because that repeating element doesn't have to be rhyming, but that is one language element that can repeat. But there's also syllables per line, number of lines, syllable stress patterns. It can also be imagery, a repeat of words, phrases. And what's really cool about it is once you start getting into poetry, you begin to see it everywhere. All it takes is repetition. A great example of this is music. Poetry in sound form. There's repeated notes or groupings of notes. For the record, these groupings are called stanzas. Songs with lyrics are also poetry. There's a repetition with the syllables, but also with the chorus. For the syllable count repetition, count how many syllables before each breath. You should find matching numbers. If you'd like to understand, speak a song. Now, we're not going for the sound or the meaning of the lyrics themselves. What we're looking at is the structure itself. So while it may lose its lyrical or melodic quality. The beat poem style reveals itself. Words repeat and thoughts repeat. And as I said, syllable counts repeat. In terms of expression, poetry is a faster and perhaps easier form than prose. Poems are not nearly as long as novels. The closest cousin in the prose world would be flash fiction. And if you remember back, that's between 300 and 1,500 words. Now, as we discuss poetry over a few videos, a lot of it will sound clinical. And that's because, in a way, it is. As we said in the definition section, poetry is something you experience, that you feel. But to define it takes this clinical look. So you're going to get a lot of definitions and examples that only help you understand. After that, you apply them and get that emotional connection, that feel. But for a lot of them, the definitions are just our way of classifying the various repeating elements. So if someone classifies their poem as trochaic hexameter or dactylic tetrameter, you'll know how it's supposed to sound. But we'll cover that in another video. Though it's likely you're already familiar with one form of poetic metric, and that's iambic pentameter. Why? That's the pattern Shakespeare used for his plays and sonnets. But that too is for another video. For now, thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.